The Montana winter was merciless, the kind that clawed at the bones and froze every breath before it left the mouth. But inside the small cabin at the edge of town, a widow named Clara kept a single fire alive. She had been called the Black Widow by the locals, not for anything sinister, but because grief had wrapped itself around her like a second skin. Her husband, a ranch hand with more dreams than wages, had died 3 winters back in an accident. No one spoke of too loudly, and since then Clara had worn black. She fed herself by baking bread for the Miller's family, mending clothes, and sometimes trading the quilts she stitched through long, lonely nights. She had little, but she carried herself with the stubborn dignity of a woman who refused to fall. That night, with the wind screaming like wolves and snow piling high against her door, she heard it, a desperate knock, uneven and hollow, like the person behind it wasn't sure they'd survive another moment. Clara opened the door to find a man half collapsed in the snow, his coat torn, his boots ruined, his face hidden beneath a tangle of ice and exhaustion. Without hesitation, she dragged him inside, as much out of instinct as pity. She peeled the frozen layers off his body and sat him near the fire, her hands working swiftly, her heart racing with the old fear of inviting a stranger into her home, but compassion overruled it. He was silent, his lips blue, his body trembling so violently she thought he might shatter. Clara made soup from the last of her potatoes and carrots, fed him spoon by spoon until some color returned to his cheeks, and when he finally whispered, "Thank you," his voice cracked like a man who hadn't spoken in days. She did not ask who he was or what storm had beaten him down. Instead, she gave him one of her late husband's shirts, still folded in the cedar chest, and told him he could rest by the fire until morning. All night she watched him sleep, half wondering if she had saved a drifter or a thief, but something about the lines of his face, the scars along his hands, told her he was a man who had worked hard, perhaps harder than he should have. By dawn, the storm had quieted, but her guest had not left. He rose slowly, still weak, and asked if he could chop wood for her in repayment. Clara almost laughed. The pile outside was taller than her, but she let him go, watching from the window as he swung, the axe with a strength that belied his fragile state. For days he stayed, repairing her roof, fixing the broken latch on her barn, carrying water from the frozen creek without complaint. He never offered his name, and she never asked. To Clara, he was simply the stranger she had fed, and to him she was the widow who had shown him mercy. Yet as the days turned into a week, something shifted. At the table, she caught him watching her with an expression not of pity but of respect, as though he saw in her the iron will she herself had long forgotten. When he smiled, rare and fleeting, it warmed the cabin more than the fire ever could. And though Clara tried to remind herself that grief was her only companion, her heart betrayed her with its quiet flutter. One evening, as snow drifted like silver feathers outside, he finally spoke of himself. Not fully, just a sliver. He said he had spent his life working land, that he knew cattle and horses better than most men knew their own kin. Clara listened, nodding, assuming he was another ranch hand who had fallen on hard times. She told him of her husband, of the accident, of how people called her the Black Widow. The man's eyes softened then, and though he didn't reach for her hand, the silence between them felt like a promise. The truth, though, was far beyond anything Clara could have guessed. For the stranger was no drifter, no common ranch hand. His name was Jacob Mercer, the quiet and reclusive owner of nearly every ranch in Montana. He was a man of vast land and wealth. Though he dressed in worn clothes and preferred to live simply, riding the ranges instead of sitting in grand houses, he had come into the storm that night because he'd been inspecting a far corner of his property when his horse had spooked and thrown him. Instead of heading for the safety of his ranch house, he had wandered aimlessly, injured and dazed, until he found Clara's cabin, and in her kindness, he had seen something wealth could not buy. A woman who gave without asking, who carried sorrow yet still offered warmth to a stranger. For years, Jacob had been surrounded by people who wanted his money, his influence, his power, but Clara had asked nothing. She had not pried, had not even shown curiosity about his name. She had simply fed him, and that act struck him deeper than he had words for. As the days stretched, Jacob realized he did not want to leave. Clara, though wary, found herself reluctant to let him go. They fell into a rhythm. She cooked, he mended. She stitched, he chopped wood. She cried sometimes at night when she thought he couldn't hear, and he pretended not to notice, though it tore him apart. Then one morning, when the thaw finally began and the sun painted the hills gold, Jacob made a choice. He saddled a horse from her small barn, and before riding away, he told her quietly, "Clara, you've given me more than food. You've given me reason." She blinked, not understanding, and by the time she stepped outside, he was gone, leaving only hoof prints in the snow. Days turned into weeks, and Clara convinced herself it had been a dream, that the stranger was just another ghost passing through her lonely life. Until one afternoon, when a line of riders appeared over the ridge, and at their front was Jacob, clean-shaven in a coat of fine leather, with the air of a man no one could mistake for a drifter. Behind him came wagons filled with supplies, food, lumber, tools, even new dresses wrapped in paper. The town followed too, murmuring in awe, because word had spread the stranger Clara had sheltered was Jacob Mercer, the man who held more ranches than anyone in Montana. Clara stood at her door stunned, clutching her apron as Jacob dismounted and walked straight to her. "You fed me when I was nothing but a half-frozen man," he said, his voice steady, caring for all to hear. "You treated me like a human being, not a name or a fortune. And I won't forget it. Clara, if you'll have me, I'd rather face every winter by your side than spend another season alone in an empty house." The crowd gasped, the whispers rising like wind, but Clara only stared, her heart pounding. She thought of her grief, her years of loneliness, the names the town had given her. Then she thought of the man who had chopped her wood, eaten her soup, and looked at her as if she were more than just a widow. Slowly, she reached for his hand. "Jacob," she whispered, "I didn't save you for anything in return, but if you mean it, if you're here for me, and not for what people say, I'll stand with you." His eyes shone then, and in the silence of the town, he kissed her hand as though it were the rarest treasure. From that day on, Clara was no longer the Black Widow of Montana, but the woman who had turned a stranger's hunger into a love story whispered across the plains. Spring came to Montana slowly, melting the edges of snowdrifts and filling the meadows with wild flowers. But for Clara, it felt like a rebirth. No longer did she walk through town with her head bowed, avoiding the whispers of Black Widow. Now, when she went to the miller's to trade bread, people greeted her with cautious respect, some even with envy, for everyone knew Jacob Mercer had returned for her. Yet with respect came suspicion, for the town could not fathom why a man of Jacob's standing, a man who owned land from the Yellowstone to the high ridges, would choose a widow who had nothing but a worn cabin and grief for company. Clara, unused to eyes watching her every move, struggled with the weight of their stares, but Jacob never faltered.
He came often, not as a rich rancher parading his claim,
but as the same man she had first met, quiet, steady, carrying firewood in his arms or mending her fence with his own hands. He spoke little of business, though she overheard the ranchers in town whispering about his power, his holdings, the decisions he could make that affected the livelihood of hundreds. None of it mattered to Clara, for to her he was still the freezing stranger she had fed. Yet beneath that simplicity, she began to notice things, the way riders tipped their hats to him, the way townsfolk hushed when he entered a room, the letters that arrived by courier, stamped with seals she didn't understand. She realized slowly that the man she had opened her door to was carrying burdens far larger than she could see. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun sink low, Jacob finally opened up. "Clara," he said, his voice low, "I didn't just come here for your kindness. I came because for too long I've been surrounded by people who only saw my land, my wealth, my name. You saw none of that. You saved me like I was just a man, and I've never wanted anything more than to be seen like that again." Clara listened, her heart aching with both tenderness and fear, for though his words were true, she worried she could never stand in a world that seemed far too large for her. She told him so, whispering, "Jacob, I am only a widow in a cabin. I don't belong in the halls of ranchers and owners. I don't belong in your world." But Jacob shook his head and took her hand, rough against hers. "My world means nothing without you, and if you can give me your courage, I'll give you every tomorrow." The weeks that followed tested them. Some of Jacob's men resisted the idea of their powerful employer tying himself to a woman they saw as weak or cursed, and rumors spread that Clara had bewitched him with her dark eyes and loneliness. Others whispered that she would never bear the children he needed to carry on his name, that she was too broken by loss. Clara, though, bore it all with quiet strength. Just as she had borne the winters before, she worked beside Jacob when he came to her cabin, showing him how to patch quilts and mend bread dough, laughing when his big hands fumbled, and crying quietly when he whispered. That her laugh was the sound he had been searching for all his life. Slowly, even the town began to change. Where once they had judged her, they now saw a woman who had not bowed to despair, but had lifted a man the world already thought was unshakable. Her story spread across the ranches how the black widow had fed a freezing stranger, not knowing he was Jacob Mercer, and how in feeding him, she had unknowingly fed hope back into his heart. But storms never stay away in Montana, and the greatest test came one summer when a fire raged across the western ridge. Jacob's cattle were trapped, and his men fought desperately to drive them to safety. Clara, instead of staying behind, rode into the smoke with a scarf tied over her face, helping guide calves and foals out of the flames. When the fire finally died and Jacob found her, her face streaked with ash and her hands blistered, his heart nearly broke at the sight. "Clara," he whispered, cradling her like something fragile, "you could have died." She looked up at him, her eyes fierce despite the soot. "And what kind of wife would I be if I let you fight alone?" That word, wife, slipped out like an accident, but Jacob caught it, and instead of fear, a smile broke across his face. Days later, beneath the wide Montana sky, Jacob Mercer asked Clara to marry him, not with jewels or speeches, but with the simple truth that he wanted no land, no fortune, no future without her. And Clara, once called cursed, once mocked as a shadow, said yes with tears of gratitude and joy. Their wedding was small, held in the meadow where wildflowers swayed in the breeze, but it became legend, a story told in every saloon and around every fire, how a widow's kindness saved a stranger, and how that stranger turned out to be the richest man in Montana, who found his greatest treasure, not in land or cattle, but in the heart of a woman who had nothing to give but her compassion. And my dear listeners, let this remind you, love and kindness often bloom when you least expect them. Just as Clara's single bowl of soup changed her fate forever, your smallest act of generosity may be the very thing that turns a stranger into a blessing. If this chapter moved you, if you believe in the power of love rising from loss, don't forget to subscribe right now, because more stories like this, full of hope, fate, and second chances, are coming your way.